So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I built my presentation on the last presentation given by Professor Cocconi, and my first slide is just a kind of refresher and a reminder that until we go to a marketing authorization or an application for an authorization, we have different clinical trials to pass, to have a package ready we can submit. And you have to understand that all the three different clinical trials have different function. And you have to take home again that the clinical trial phase 1 is not designed at all to look on efficacy. Your device or your medication will not even see a patient. There are just a few exceptions, but most of the time it is just a study involving healthy volunteers. And then at the end of this process, we have a clinical phase 3 study. This is also the crown of our clinical trials, and it's a crown because it's the last step until you can prepare your package for your marketing authorization approval. But it's also the crown because it's a quite significant size of a clinical trial. You have a couple of hundred until several thousand patients, and it is designed, and this is really key here for all what I will present to you within the next few minutes. It is designed to have an understanding of the efficacy of your compound and device. Of course, you will, at the end of your clinical phase 3, have also an understanding of the major side effects and that they are not targeted by your compound or by your device. But the design for your clinical phase 3 is primarily to test for efficacy of your compound or of your device. And then it's not really surprising anymore that depending on a group of diseases, to see that 70 to 90% of the compounds going into a phase 3 successfully pass phase 3. And the reason is a very simple one, because your phase 2 looks already on efficacy. And if you have an indication of efficacy in a phase 2, it's very likely that you get it then significant in a phase 3 clinical study. Therefore, if you go for especially clinical phase 2 and clinical phase 3 clinical trials, such trials are focusing on efficacy. And here's an important point: safety is usually a secondary endpoint. It's generally underpowered and is not pre-specified because usually you do not know which kind of side effects you are looking on, and therefore you cannot specify such side effects. You have to understand that such clinical trials until phase 3 have a variety of significant limitations. And the first limitation is your patient collective viewer including in your clinical trial. This is just a summary of almost 300 randomized clinical trials to see which kind of patients or which kind of part of the population is included and which kind of the population is excluded. And I guess it's not surprising to see that 60% of all clinical trials did not include kids. But it is already very surprising to see that 40% excluded older patients. And older does not mean 85 and older. We talk about 65 and older. And this is quite surprising, and I should take it out from my slide, but I still keep it, that in almost half of our clinical trials until 2007, women have been excluded. And the reason that I should take it out, this is not permitted anymore. So if you do not have a gender-specific disease, in any other case, you are not allowed to exclude one of the gender if you go for a clinical trial. But historically, it means many of the compounds we have in use now, medications in use, when it came to a marketing authorization, no woman had ever seen the compound. And of course, you have to understand that often concurrent diseases are simply excluded. And the reason is you want to be as plain as possible in the design of your clinical trial phase 3, because if there's a comorbidity and you have an event, you do not want to come in a discussion whether this relates to your compound or your drug or device or whether it relates to the comorbidity. Another limitation at the end of your clinical phase 3 is the size of the number of your patients included in your clinical trial. I mentioned it as a couple of hundred until a couple of thousands, but I show here an example how long it needed until compounds or medications with marketing authorization have been withdrawn from a market. And the most extreme one is fenfluramine. It's an anti-obesity drug in a clinical trial, phase 3. 340 people have been exposed to this medication. It received marketing authorization, and until they understood that there's a significant increase in heart valve disease, in cardiac fibrosis, in pulmonary hypertension, it needed exposure to almost 7 million people. So this is, of course, something you cannot go for in the clinical trial phase 3. Just because it's a quite straight program I have here, probably in the interest of time, because we are already late, we collect all the questions and we make then question, answer at the end of the presentation. It's my suggestion just to ensure that I get a little bit of the time back we lost and to bring you on time to your lunch. So what you have to understand is, and this is a message here, you have at the end of your clinical phase 2, clinical phase 3, a quite adequate evidence and understanding that your compound or device is efficient. You have a very good evidence, or you have a good evidence at least, that the most common adverse effects are not occurring. And therefore, when you prepare your package to apply for a marketing authorization, you have the data supporting a positive benefit-risk ratio. However, there are a variety of things you do not know when you prepare your package. And it is especially on the safety side, because again, safety in a clinical trial phase 3 is underpowered. And if you look on safety, there are a few things you do not know, and many of them you cannot know, but you have to be aware that this is a limitation of your clinical trials, phase 2 and phase 3. So the first of all is, if you have a rare occurrence of a side effect, then you might not be able to see this. If it is in 1 of 1,000 and you include 500 patients, this side effect might not occur at all. Then a delayed effect of your medication. So the classical discussion we have is related to a compound targeting a specific peptidase, neprilysin, and if you do this in the periphery with Entresto, then it has lovely effects and prevents cardiovascular events. However, if you would target such peptidase in the brain, it would not target anymore beta amyloid. You have an increase in this, you have a plaque generation, and you would generate an Alzheimer phenotype. So the company, of course, argues this is not occurring because it's not passing the blood-brain barrier, but in a long-term exposure where you might have events where you have a compromised blood-brain barrier, this might happen. And then it needs, again, years until you have an accumulation of beta amyloid, plaque generation, and then your Alzheimer phenotype. Then, of course, there might be a difference if you have a chronic exposure in comparison to what you had in your clinical trial as short-term exposure. Then medication error of label use, I guess I do not have to explain that this is, of course, a limitation, and you do not have such events in your clinical trial phase 3 because your patients know what they have to do, they are included, everything is addressed, so this is not an issue. This is the same for association with abuse and misuse, and then again, and this is a point I mentioned already, you do not know everything regarding adverse effects of your drug or your device when it comes to a specific population you did not include in your phase 3 clinical trial. And therefore, you have to understand it's a quite challenging approach for the authorities. In Europe, it's the EMA, to come to a decision. On one hand, from the clinical trial phase 3, you know you have a compound that has significant efficacy parameters, and you would like to bring it to a patient. However, you know on the other hand, there are safety issues that cannot be addressed with a clinical trial phase 3. And to bring the authorities out of the dilemma, there's another tool in place, and it's named clinical phase 4, or a clinical trial phase 4, or also post-marketing surveillance trial. And you have different parts in a phase 4 clinical trial. The first one is, it could be initiated by a company because they are interested to compare their drug with another drug and to see or show that it's superior to another drug. You would like to show in the long run that it is, from a cost effectiveness perspective, it's better than other treatments being in place, or you would like to see how is the effectiveness in a long run. But whenever the company started a clinical phase 4, company or you have to be aware of the fact at the end of a phase 4, you can go the risk that you lose your marketing authorization, or that there are restrictions to the use within the marketing authorization. And to ensure that safety is observed and followed and evaluated post-marketing authorization, and that we do not have a situation that whenever a compound is approved, there's no control anymore. We have a package of legislation in place related to pharmacovigilance. I guess it's quite small here, but it's the usual construct. When it comes to European legislation, you have a directive, and the directive frames what relates to pharmacovigilance, and then you have the regulation itself saying how this should be turned into reality. And it was a massive change implemented in 2010, and you will see from an implementation until it is really in place and it is in use, it might take a while. One of the key things with this new legislation has been that whatever we had with pharmacovigilance has been harmonized between the FDA and the EMA. So we have now databases in place on both sides that are available to the public, and you can see all the information related to pharmacovigilance online. You have, and this is what I will talk about the next 15 minutes, you have now in a risk management plan, you have 2 tools in place. It's the post-authorization safety and the post-authorization efficacy study. And just to mention it here, you have regulations now related to drug safety initiatives and to drug safety consortia. The path again, and this would be the same for the post-authorization efficacy study. These are tools given to the authorities to ensure that also there might be questions related to safety when it comes to a marketing authorization, to ensure that in the long run such data related to safety will be available. And this is exactly what it's saying here. If you look on the definition, it has to confirm the safety profile of a medical product or measure the effectiveness of the risk management measures. This sounds quite complicated, but in the end, it's just saying you have different ways to look on the safety of a compound, and is it really the right approach to measure the safety of your compound? If you look on the post-authorization safety studies, the objectives are clear. You have to quantify the potential of identified risk. You have to evaluate the risk of a medical product used in a patient or in a population. And you have to provide the evidence for the absence of a risk. So in the end, what you have to do is, if there's any concern regarding a compound, your medication, or a device, then this has to be addressed and has to be answered using these safety studies. What you have to know is the marketing authorization holder is initiating, managing, and financing the study. However, initiating is a little bit misleading because it sounds like it is your decision whether you would like to go for such a study or not. And in case this is not how it is. The reality is, I say it again, this is a tool authorities have, so the EMA has. So the EMA says to you, guys, there's a question, there is a concern, and you have to go for a safety study to take such worries away. However, afterwards, it is on your side to initiate your study, to construct the study, to manage, and to finance it. You have different categories of a safety study. The first one is, of course, it is as a part of whenever you get your marketing authorization, then it is a condition that you have to go for a safety study, or, and this is quite often happening in a real world, you suddenly have an indication that there is a safety issue you did not see in your phase 2 and in your phase 3 studies for the reasons I shared with you. And if this is the case and the authorities have such feedback, then at any time point, they can say to you, you have to go for a safety study to see, is there really a significant safety issue, or can these worries be taken away by showing that there is no significant difference? You have then also a category 2 safety study, and this is a safety study that is linked and connected to a marketing authorization under exceptional circumstance. And this sounds quite strange, and an exceptional circumstance means you apply for your marketing authorization and you get an approval. Also, it is clear that there are worries, but it is not in your hand as an applicant to take such worries away in time you prepare your package. Sounds complicated, but what it's just saying is, if there are indications for a rare event, and with your clinical trial 3, it's clear you are not in a position to get such an answer. Is this event triggered by my compound? Do I have significant increase? But you know, this is so rare that it would need, let's say, 20 or 30,000 patients. Then the authorities would not say, we hold your application until you have 30,000 patients. But they would say, okay, we see that there might be a worry. You get your marketing authorization, but there is a but, and it has to be linked to a safety study to ensure in an observational study, in a long-term exposure to specific population or to more patients, whether there is really a safety issue or not. And if you have such an authorization under exceptional circumstances or granted with exceptional circumstances, then it could mean that if you apply that it's a prescription-free medication, then they will say you get this, but one of the circumstances is, or specific conditions we give you the marketing authorization is that it has to be prescribed, or in your leaflet, specific things have to be labeled as not tested so far to have a clear warning regarding the use of your compound. And again, you have also a category 3 where it goes regarding the effectiveness of risk minimization activities. Is something that what I tried to explain to you. Sounds quite complicated, but I guess when it comes to safety, again, there are different ways to look on it, and you have to show then that the way you use is the effective one to get the right conclusion on the safety. But what you have to know, doesn't matter which kind of category you go or you have to go, because it's instructed by the authorities, the information has to be given and implemented in a specific e-register. And a lovely example for a path and which kind of consequences this post-authorization safety study, in this case under category 1 has, is shown with one of the classical drugs, oh, it's not here. One of the classical drugs is Rosiglitazone. And Rosiglitazone is an anti-diabetic drug. Let's say 10 years or a little bit more than 10 years ago, it was one of the blockbusters with 2.6 billion per year. So it was really significant. And to understand what I'm trying to explain to you, but it was quite dry to talk about the past, here's an example how such things work. if you see when the company applied for marketing authorization, it was 99. They had exposed 1,000 or almost 2,000 patients to Rosiglitazone, but they had the length of the trial has been approximately 1 year, but it was already clear when they submitted it was inadequate for assessing effects on the drug on micro and macrovascular complications, and it has been already known that there's an increase in fluid retention, and it has been known that there's an increase in body weight and LDL levels. It came to the authorities, and it has been evaluated by EMA and FDA in a quite different way. The FDA said, if we go for our benefit-risk ratio, it's clear, also knowing we have such side effects here, the benefit to a diabetic patient here by significantly lowering the blood glucose concentration is simply higher than the risk we have. So we have a positive benefit-risk ratio. The EMA said, we have too many worries here, and we will not give you a marketing authorization. However, the company appealed against it, and in 2001, the EMA gave marketing authorization, but with a requirement to perform a post-authorization safety study. So here is a classical tool where they received the marketing authorization, but with a clear but, because they had to perform a safety study. The company started then, after 2001, to develop a trial named RECORD, and this is something we talk about in a second. That again, 2006, 2.6 billion per year for Rosiglitazone. And then 2007, there was a meta-analysis showing that if you just pool a variety of clinical trials, we have a significant higher incidence for myocardial infarction in patients exposed to Rosiglitazone. And this is just an example how powerful meta-analysis are. You will have quite a few more today and tomorrow when it comes to statistical analysis and clinical trials. And this was a clear warning, and the EMA took such data from this meta-analysis, and they said it should not be recommended anymore for the use in patients with ischemic heart disease or peripheral arterial disease, and they made it clear it is not applicable and cannot be given anymore to patients post-myocardial infarction. But there was an approval, but the approval was now with restrictions. However, in parallel, as I said to you, the company has been forced by EMA to perform a clinical trial. The clinical trial was named RECORD. It was a RECORD clinical trial, and it has been then published in 2008 or 2009 in Lancet. And the outcome was, and it's quite small here, but what they say, indeed, we see that we have more fractions in females, and indeed we have a higher incidence of myocardial infarction. Nevertheless, if we look on mortality and morbidity, then we do not have a significant increase in our Rosiglitazone patients in comparison to the one not taking the compound and having just exposed to standard therapy. And they hope that they are off the hook. Unfortunately, and this is really important to you, whenever you design your clinical trials, this is something that should not happen. So it has been published, and immediately after, many researchers and also the authorities stood up and said, but such clinical trial has massive, massive limitations. And the limitation in the RECORD study was, it was an open label study. So this is anyway not working anymore, but it was an open label study, and you know, then you are biased if you want, if you do not want, but there's a bias in it, and it makes it already very questionable whatever outcome you have. Then it's really important what they did. They looked, this was the endpoint, myocardial infarction, and they assumed in their study group that 11% of all patients will get myocardial infarction, and they made the whole statistical calculation for how many patients have to be included based on 11%. In reality, just 2.6% of all patients got a myocardial infarction, and you can assume that it was massively underpowered to get really a statistical conclusion whether there is an increase in myocardial infarction or there is no increase. And just here, another one, 40% of the patients withdraw the treatment with Rosiglitazone. And if you take Professor Basillou's presentation, if you are correct, you would assume that all which dropped out could develop myocardial infarction and should be in reality in a myocardial infarction group. However, the dropout here was much, much higher than another group, and therefore it was disbalanced and was not valid anymore. And this is related to the open label study. The Rosiglitazone group reported significantly higher treatment with lipid-lowering drugs. At this time, we had just the statins, and therefore they had a benefit by having higher doses of this co-treatment in comparison to the one not getting Rosiglitazone. So there have been significant concerns, and the conclusion was this record study is nothing we can use to have really a conclusion on the safety of the compound. However, in parallel, the same guys going for the meta-analysis in 2007 took all their data from 2007, they incorporated the record study, and they said, even if you take all the data from this study together with all what we have so far, we still have a significant reduction, increase in the likelihood of getting myocardial infarction. And taking this together, the EMA met, and they came to the conclusion in 2010 to suspend Rosiglitazone from the market. The important story is here, and this is something you really have to understand. Whenever such thing happen and there is a recommendation for suspension from a market by EMA or by FDA, read the next sentence. It does not mean that the door is closed forever. If you are able to provide data, making a case that indeed the conclusions so far have been wrong, or, and this is more likely, indeed there's a subpopulation of patients which significantly benefit from Rosiglitazone in this case, but we do not have the worries or the concerns of myocardial infarction, then you can reapply for a marketing authorization related to such specific patient population.
Most likely it will be underpowered if it's a subset, very small subset of patients.
Should we make it at the end?
I said that it would be, most likely it would be underpowered if you just look at a subset of patients showing a benefit, but the risk...
No, you misunderstood me. It's not so that you re-evaluate your data and you just look on it. It's more likely that you have to go for an own study, a new study to get the power. Yeah? So it's very likely if you would just go for a subpopulation in your study and you are already underpowered for the main endpoint, then you would be underpowered for almost all other endpoints. But if you would like to reapply, you have to ensure that the data and the material you are submitting is not underpowered anymore. So it is very, very likely that you have to go for an independent clinical trial to support your case.
So you have a strategy for risk mitigation, something that will reduce the risk.
Could I make a suggestion?
I made this already, but...
No, because we're running out of time.
I made the suggestions that we...
I want you to discuss as much as you can. Why don't we finish Thomas' talk, and then we have Mr. Bartich talk, and then we have time to discuss. Maybe that's better, because then we have another view as well. Is that okay?
Okay, and just very shortly to have the second tool also named, the authorities have in hand, it is a post-authorization efficacy study. And it's already the name, it's a difference to the safety study. Here we do not look primarily on the safety, but we look on efficacy. And it might sound quite strange because efficacy is something that should be supported by your data when you submit your outcome of your phase 3, because it looks primarily on efficacy. But in the real world, often there are still question marks related to the efficacy. Or in the long run, exposing it to more patients, there is a generation of questions related to the efficacy. And in such a case, the authorities have a tool to say you have to go for a post-authorization efficacy study. It's an exceptional tool for standard marketing authorization, And again, it relates to efficacy evaluation. And it is really important to understand that whenever you go for such efficacy study, the difference to the safety study is you have no freedom to operate when it comes to your study. So the EMA will say to you how you have to design your study to ensure that in the end you have the real data and trustable data related to the efficacy of your compound. So this is a clear difference between a safety study and efficacy study. For the safety study, you have the freedom to operate and to design your trial, and it can end in a disaster, as I had shown for the RECORD study. But here, for efficacy study, there's no way to perform and design your own study. This is given by the authorities. And I said to you that the regulation, the directive and the regulation came in 2010. And how to turn this pharmacovigilance into reality related to the efficacy studies needed quite a while. And you see here how many different authorities or organizations had to have a look on it, how many of them had to pre-approve until finally the new rules have been in place. And it is just, I mean, it's 1st of June 2017. So the law came in 2010, and the final practical things related to pharmacovigilance came 7 years later. So the taking home message of what I said to you is, and it might be a surprise, but it is the reality. Whenever you perform your clinical trials, phase 2, phase 3, at the end, your sample or patient size is too small, the clinical trial is too short and based on surrogate endpoints to really detect all the risk. And as I had shown to you with the example, 350 in the phase 3, 7 million until it has been withdrawn from a market. It's simply from a practicality perspective that sometimes or most or often it needs exposure to more patients. It needs exposure to specific patient populations to understand and to see and to identify a risk you might not have seen in your clinical trial phase 2 and 3. And here's the good news, and this is what I wanted to show to you in my presentation. The authorities have tools in hand to ensure that also post-marketing authorization, you have surveillance, post-marketing surveillance, and you have pharmacovigilance, ensuring that whenever there's an issue with the safety of a medication or a device, that it will be investigated. Thank you very much for your attention.